in the world is Michael? I've been standing out here for half an hour.
Hey, Tom, look what I won on eBay.
Wow, Michael, what is it?
It's a DeLorean.
Is it like a time-traveling DeLorean?
Is there any other kind? Probably, but who cares? This one actually does travel back in time, and I'm going to take us on a fun trip.
Oh, I can't wait. Oh, maybe we could go meet Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, or go back to 1776, or even the Constitutional Convention. How about one of those things?
Boring. All right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take you back with me to the motherland.
Weren't you born in Russia?
No, Tom. The Soviet Union.
In my experience, in particular, younger people have absolutely no idea about what communism is like, the scale and scope of the atrocities, the unbelievably scarlet crimes. They know nothing about it. Now, in a way, you can hardly blame them, because it's not as if the cultural establishment is going out of its way to inform them about these things. The popular view is that American journalists and intellectuals were, of course, opposed to Soviet communism, and they warned the world about this terrible threat. And some of them did, but many American intellectuals were cheerleaders of the Soviet system, or even openly on the Soviet team. It's almost to the point where it's become hip to be vaguely sympathetic to communism, or joke about it, or just not take it seriously.
Looking back at the horrors of communism, it makes people giggle instead of kind of go for tissue and want to cry. You'll see the Che Guevara shirts, but that's just a small part of it. If you talk about people fighting communism back in the day, it's kind of like, oh, this was silly, everyone was hysterical, it wasn't that big a deal. Well, it kind of is a big deal when literally every phone call you make, someone is listening to, and when kids are taught at school to turn their parents into the police. While this was going on overseas in many countries for decades, in full force was the American excuse factory, just brushing aside all the horrors that were taking place and even pretending that things are wonderful. And this was a model for us to follow.
The best example of this was a journalist named Lincoln Steffens, who wrote for a publication called McClure's. In 1919, he went to Russia. He came back and he said, "I have been over into the future, and it works." Now, some historians say he wrote that line even before he left for Russia, so he was going to whitewash that place no matter what he saw. But it wasn't just him. It was a lot of American intellectuals who went over there and told us wonderful stories about how great everything was. So we had Jane Addams, we had Rexford Tugwell, who served under FDR, we had all these books coming forth, like The Challenge of Russia by Sherwood Eddy. Or how about this one, George Counts's The Soviet Challenge to America. Or how about this one, Maxwell Stewart, Where Everyone Has a Job. And in fact, John Dewey, the famous educator, said in the New Republic magazine in 1928 that I have never seen anywhere in the world such a large proportion of happy and intelligently occupied children. Then there's Oswald Garrison Villard, who was editor of The Nation magazine, which still publishes to this day. Despite not speaking Russian, never having met a Russian peasant, he still felt qualified to say in 1929, after more than a decade of one-party rule and concentration camps and systematic censorship, that what we were dealing with in Russia was what he called the social, moral, political, industrial, economic emancipation of a people.
My people had a very different approach to dealing with the atrocities of communism. Rather than make excuses for it, sometimes we made jokes. And here's how one of them goes. Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, is sitting at his desk. Things are going very badly for Nikita, but he's got a drawer that says, in case of emergency, open me. He opens the drawer, and the first letter from Stalin says, blame everything on me. So he goes out and says everything bad that's happening was Stalin's fault. Things keep getting worse. People don't have food. The factories aren't producing. And across the ocean, the United States has elected a hunk for president. Khrushchev goes back to his desk, pulls open that drawer, reads that second letter, and it says, write 2 letters to your successor.
And the argument in Soviet Russia, and the argument that their apologists in the West made, was you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. But what's really disturbing about that quotation is those so-called eggs were the lives of tens of millions of people. And as someone else famously pointed out, where were the omelets?
Tom, how'd you like it if I invite you over to my house? And I said, Tom, I'm going to make you a great, delicious breakfast. It'll be the kind of breakfast no one has ever seen before. It'll be the most stupendous breakfast ever undertaken. It's a whole new level of breakfast, and we're leaving the old ways behind.
I can't wait.
Okay, so breakfast isn't ready, but when you come for brunch, I'm going to have the best brunch you'll ever see. It'll be stupendous. We're leaving the old ways of making brunch behind, and there's going to be so much food, you won't know what to do with yourself.
I'm going to get tired of all this winning.
Okay, here's the deal. Brunch isn't here, but if you come back for lunch, or possibly dinner, or maybe supper, I think that's different.
Michael, I waited till 2 o'clock in the morning. Where the are my omelets?
You're still here? Sure, there were many American intellectuals who thought the Soviet experiment, as they called it, was something worth looking into, something that they thought had promise. That didn't necessarily mean, right, that they were literal communists taking orders from a foreign power dedicated to violently overthrowing the government.
Was there really infiltration of communists into the U.S. government? It's fashionable today to say that the very idea was a ridiculous conspiracy. And we associate all this with Joe McCarthy to the point where we call it McCarthyism, the asking of questions about whether or not people are communists, particularly in sensitive positions in the U.S. government.
Not just communists in the sense of agreeing with communism, communists in the sense of being members of the Communist Party, a party which was getting its orders from a foreign power with the agenda of overthrowing the government, and doing so secretly. This is not a conspiracy theory, this was conspiracy history.
Well, as a matter of fact, in 1995, we finally got declassified what are known as the Venona Project files. They were made available to the American public, finally. These were a series of transcripts of thousands of Soviet intelligence messages from the 1940s, when at the time, the U.S. government had discovered a vulnerability inside Soviet intelligence transmission, and they captured a whole lot of these messages. And it turns out that when you sift through them, 350 people in the U.S. government had relationships with Soviet intelligence. That's not a small thing. The Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, was certainly involved, as Venona shows, in inappropriate communications, to say the least, with Soviet intelligence. Also Lawrence Duggan, who coordinated American relations with Latin America, and Lachlan Curry, who was a special assistant to FDR. These people are not minor individuals. These are significant figures. So this isn't some crazy theory somebody thought up. This was an actual problem.
Ronald Reagan was the first union president. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And part of his role was to figure out just how deeply communist agents had invaded Hollywood. And again, by communists, he meant people taking orders directly from a foreign government, not just those who simply had a different political point of view. And this was the actors who were worried about how much communism had taken root among their peers. This is where the expression card-carrying communist came from. They were members of a specific organization. And to this day, the technique used to fight the people who were fighting them was snark and humor. Oh, you're paranoid. No one's taking orders from a foreign power. This is all just a witch hunt. The problem is, there really were witches. And their schemes led to some very bad consequences, including stealing the plans for the deadliest weapon ever seen on Earth, the atom bomb, and handing it over to Stalin, one of the worst dictators the world had ever seen. What ended up happening is many of these former communists flipped and realized, wait a minute, I'm fighting for some really evil people. And they came forward, they outed their former colleagues, and to this day, they're portrayed as evil for pointing out which one of their peers were secretly taking orders from Moscow in order to destroy America. That was the goal.
The great celebrated case, of course, involved Alger Hiss, who'd been a U.S. State Department official, and Richard Nixon, who came to be hated after this particular episode, helped get him found guilty of perjury when he claimed that he had not known Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers had been part of the U.S. Communist Party, and he was one of the people who later flipped when he suddenly examined himself and realized he'd been on the wrong side.
What ended up happening is many of these former communists realized, wait a minute, I'm not fighting for any sort of emancipation at all. I'm fighting for the absolute totalitarian oppression of a people and a government that is intent on bringing their revolution to every country in the world. And to this day, investigating communism is regarded as the worst thing that's ever happened in American history. And then you turn on the TV and you hear that Russia has influenced our elections in a way that apparently they never have in the past, or only started doing so in 2016.
All right, Michael, this is all well and good, but a lot of people, including journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, filmmaker Michael Moore, think that, at least in theory, communism is about helping people and treating people equally. That on the one hand, we have the Nazis, whom everybody in his right mind recognizes were evil and genocidal and hyper-nationalistic and focused maniacally on racialist theories, but communism wasn't that way at all, because they just want to bring prosperity and happiness to everyone equally.
The thing is, everything works in theory. That's what makes it a theory. What if I told you both of these groups were really bad, and it's perfectly okay to condemn them both? You could still say these are evil ideologies that can never be allowed to take root. So here's the issue. To say it works in theory, you have to make the argument that people like Castro, people like Maduro in Venezuela today, Stalin, they weren't really communists. They didn't really mean what they were doing. They always say real communism has never been tried. Well, let's take a look at what fake communism looked like. Stalin took many different ethnicities from their ancestral homelands, forcibly repopulated them, killing lots of people along the way. This was a mechanism of breaking their spirits and maintaining social control. Toward the end of his life, years after the Holocaust, right before he died, Stalin was ready to unleash another pogrom against the Jews, something that the communists had condemned the Tsar for. The body count under the Soviets was very long. Millions of people over many years. This was later acknowledged by the Soviet Union, and this is the case in country after country. Pol Pot in Cambodia, the killing fields. It took 4 years in the 1970s. This wasn't that long ago. Killed between a fifth and a quarter of the entire population, including anyone who had eyeglasses, because this was a symbol of being an intellectual, and he wanted people to be rural. The death tolls of these regimes are enormous. So if country after country under communist rule has literal genocide, what does real communism mean, if not that?
And I might add, you have a lot of young people who think they're being hip and edgy wearing Che Guevara shirts. And of course, he was Fidel Castro's right-hand man in Cuba. They think this is a symbol of liberation. And at the same time, they've got their pride flags, their rainbow flags. Some people say Che executed homosexuals.
No, Tom. That's not exactly right. You're just repeating ridiculous conservative propaganda. Che sent gay people to forced slave labor camps. When he was murdering people, including, inevitably, some gay people, he was murdering people equally.
Wow, what a relief that is to hear, Michael, that he was absolutely non-discriminatory when it came to executing people. But sending gay people to camps, the idea there was that if they did really burly, manly work, this might purge them of their bourgeois deviation, namely homosexuality.
Well, did it work?
Well, Michael, as it turns out, putting people in prison does not, after all, lead to decreased homosexuality.
That Che, who so many young people wear in their shirts, had racial views that weren't exactly those of the NAACP.
Che said, "The Negro is indolent and spends his money on frivolities and booze, whereas the European is forward-looking, organized, and intelligent." Ouch.
So, Tom, what'd you think of the trip back to my motherland?
Well, not only would I not want to live there, it's not even a nice place to visit. And I'm still waiting on my omelet.
Real breakfast has never been tried.